When the daughter pushed open the door of that house for the first time in almost 3 years, no one could say a word. The smell of dust mixed with mold seemed trapped in the walls. Light filtered through the old curtain in small, weak beams, revealing particles floating slowly down the silent hallway. Dishes were still piled up in the sink. Clothes were scattered on the sofa. A sandal was still standing beside the door as if someone were still going to wear it that morning. The living room clock had stopped at 6:17 p.m. And in the bedroom, the left side of the bed remained untouched, cold, untouched, as if time had given up on passing there. But what was most frightening wasn't the mess. It was realizing that everything seemed to have been abandoned at that very moment, as if that entire house had stopped breathing. And then the daughter understood something that no one in the family had noticed before. Daisy stopped cleaning the house the same day her husband died. If you've ever experienced something similar, or know someone who gradually disappeared without anyone noticing, subscribe to the channel now. Because some silent pains need to be understood before they are judged. Margaret was 62 years old when she lost Antonio. For 38 years, they shared the same routine, the same early morning coffee, the same television program at night, the same comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every space with words. The house was always her pride and joy, the smell of cleanliness, lined towels, flowers on the table, everything in its place. Her daughters joked that their mother's house looked ready for a visit even on a regular Tuesday, but after the funeral, something inside her simply went out. At first, no one understood. The grief seemed normal. She cried little. She spoke softly. She said she was tired. People gave her space. They said time would help. But time didn't help. Time only accumulated silence in every corner of that house. First came the forgotten dishes, then the clothes began to pile up on the bedroom chair. The plants slowly died on the balcony. The windows never fully opened again, and then she began to disappear from her own life. She wouldn't answer calls. She made up excuses to avoid visitors. He said everything was fine, even when it clearly wasn't. And little by little, the comments began. She gave up. She became a hoarder. She surrendered. She was so organized. Look what she's become. The cruelest thing about emotional suffering is that it almost never seems like suffering to an outsider, because there are people who continue breathing, but inside they are completely exhausted. And that's exactly what happened to Margarita. The problem was never mess. That house was in mourning. There's a kind of pain that doesn't explode. It freezes. The person continues walking around the house, continues to exist. But simple tasks are starting to seem too heavy. Folding clothes requires energy. Washing dishes seems pointless. Choosing what to keep or throw away becomes a silent emotional battle. Because each object carries a memory, every detail reminds you of the person who left. And then the brain enters a strange state of survival. It starts saving energy even on the basics, not because the person is lazy, but because she's already too tired just trying to get through another day. Some people aren't living, they're just surviving until the next dawn, and almost no one notices. Antonio's favorite cup remained on the sink. His shirt was still hanging behind the door. The remote control remained exactly on the arm of the armchair where he sat every afternoon. It wasn't carelessness. Margaret was trying to stop time from continuing without him, because sometimes grief does that. It transforms objects into presents, and touching them feels like an emotional betrayal impossible to bear. While the family saw disorganization, she saw remnants of the only life that still made sense to her. Some people stop cleaning because they can no longer sense the future. And perhaps that's what so many people watching this video know all too well. The laundry piled up in the corner of the room, the ignored messages, the sink full of clothes, the constant tiredness, the shame of letting someone into the house, the feeling of failure growing silently. Because when the mind collapses emotionally, even small tasks begin to seem like impossible mountains to climb. And then comes the guilt of not being able to react, the guilt of being tired for no apparent reason, the guilt of not being able to go back to being who I was before. But nobody realizes that often the person is already using all the strength they have just to continue functioning minimally in the world, and this creates a silent isolation. The worse things get at home, the less the person wants to receive help. The more time passes, the greater the shame becomes, until the environment itself begins to reflect exactly their emotional state inside. That house wasn't abandoned. It was emotionally frozen on the last day Antonio was still alive. If this story is touching you in any way, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, or just write, "I understand." Sometimes the greatest proof that someone is still trying to continue is being able to recognize themselves silently within the pain of another. 3 years. That was the time Margarita spent living practically in the same 2 rooms of the house, the bedroom and the kitchen, as if the rest of her life had been slowly closed, along with the doors she no longer opened. The youngest daughter said her mother seemed distant even when answering messages. The words were short, empty, like someone trying to appear present without truly being able to be, and perhaps that's one of the hardest parts to understand about deep emotional suffering. It doesn't always appear as visible despair. Sometimes it appears as silence, as lateness, as constant exhaustion, as someone who starts abandoning small things because they can no longer bear the emotional weight of the basics. Margarita still paid the bills. He still bought bread occasionally. He still fed the cat that appeared in the yard months after Antonio's death. On the outside, she seemed functional, but inside, she had been emotionally paralyzed for a long time. There's a type of exhaustion that doesn't make a person collapse. It makes them continue living on autopilot, without presence, without energy, without being able to imagine happiness in the future. And that's precisely why so many people are unfairly judged, because the world has learned to recognize suffering only when it makes noise. But the deepest pains usually happen in absolute silence. No one saw Margarita crying. No one heard her cries for help. And that's precisely why no one noticed the magnitude of her emotional collapse. When the mind enters a state of prolonged survival, simple things begin to lose meaning. Organizing the house no longer seems like a priority. The brain stops seeing reward in tasks. Everything becomes too much effort. And then a strange feeling of paralysis arises. The person looks at the mess, but can't start. Looks at the accumulated laundry, but feels tired even before touching it. And the more time passes, the greater the shame. Because mess is no longer just mess, it becomes visible proof that something inside the person is not right. When the mind collapses, even folding clothes seems impossible. The saddest thing is that many people hearing this now know exactly what it's like. The feeling of looking at simple tasks and feeling the body heavy without being able to explain why. The guilt of leaving messages unanswered because even talking seems exhausting. The shame of not being able to maintain one's own organized routine as before. And then the silent thoughts arise that no one discusses with anyone. What happened to me? Why can't I go back to normal? Why do simple things seem so difficult now? But perhaps the right question isn't, what's wrong with me? Perhaps it's, how long have I been trying to survive emotionally without realizing it? Because the human body can endure a lot. But the mind, when it spends too much time trying to bear pain without support, begins to shut down entire parts of life to conserve emotional energy. And that's exactly what happened inside that house. The living room clock remained stopped for years because Margarita never changed the battery. Not because she forgot, but because, in some strange way, she needed something there to have also stopped in time, along with Antonio. His toothbrush was still in the bathroom, his slippers were still beside the bed, and every night before going to sleep, she would pass by the closet and silently touch one of his shirts. Small, invisible rituals that no one knew about. Small emotional attempts to continue feeling a presence that no longer physically existed. The house began to become an exact portrait of her mind. Forgotten parts, frozen parts, parts abandoned by emotional exhaustion, But there was something even more painful hidden there. Because deep down, Margarita knew the house was falling apart. She felt ashamed. Very ashamed. But the worse it got, the more impossible it seemed to even begin. And this happens to thousands of people every day. People who look around and no longer recognize their own lives. People too tired to ask for help. People who continue to smile in public while silently crumbling inside their homes. The problem was never a lack of willpower. It was an excess of accumulated pain with no space to escape. And perhaps that's why so many people end up isolating themselves when they need company the most. Because they are afraid of judgment. Afraid of being told they are exaggerating. Afraid of seeming weak. So they learn to suffer quietly. They learn to hide their emotional collapse behind simple excuses like, "I'm just tired." But the body always finds a way to show when the mind can't take it anymore. Sometimes through the mess, sometimes by abandoning their routine, sometimes through that heavy silence that slowly takes over everything. It was only when her daughter entered Margarita's room that afternoon that she noticed something impossible to ignore. Amidst the dust, there was a small, perfectly clean space beside the bed, as if someone still sat there carefully every day, as if Margarita continued to wait for company in the same place where Antonio used to sit before going to sleep. And at that moment, for the first time, the daughter stopped seeing an abandoned house and began to see a woman emotionally lost within her own grief. If you've ever felt like you were surviving on autopilot, or know someone who seems tired of living in silence, like this video, because understanding certain pains may be the only way to prevent more people from suffering alone without anyone noticing. The daughter stood in the middle of the room for a few seconds, unable to touch anything. The silence of that house seemed different now. Before it was just uncomfortable. Now it seemed sad, deeply sad, as if each object carried a silent attempt to keep someone alive within memory. The bedside lamp remained crooked, just as Antonio had left it. His drawer remained ajar. There were old coins, a broken clock, and a simple note written years before saying only, "I'll be back before dinner." Small, ordinary things. But for Margarita, they had become emotional anchors. Because when someone loses a person who was part of their own identity, the pain doesn't just take away company. It takes away routine, security, direction, and sometimes it even takes away the ability to continue organizing one's own life. The daughter began to walk slowly through the house, observing details that before seemed like just clutter. The closed curtains weren't carelessness. Margarita said the light bothered her ever since Antonio died. The piled-up pots weren't laziness. There were almost untouched meals on the stove as if she cooked without really feeling hungry. The dust-covered furniture seemed forgotten because, in a way, she had also forgotten herself. And then came the hardest part to understand. Margaret wasn't living in that house. She was waiting inside it, waiting to feel something return, waiting for the emptiness to lessen, waiting for her body to tire less, waiting for your own mind to stop hurting in silence. Some people can't move on because emotionally they're still stuck in the last moment they felt whole. And that creates an invisible freeze. Time passes on the outside, but inside, nothing really moves forward. That house was in mourning. There's something profoundly lonely about losing someone after decades. Because it's not just the physical absence. It's the disappearance of a witness to your entire life. Antonio knew the younger version of Margarita. He knew her fears, her quirks, the insecurities that no one else saw. After so many years together, she no longer knew who she was without him around. And when that connection disappeared, her brain seemed to lose the ability to reorganize its own existence. That's why some pains leave a person emotionally immobile, not because they want to remain in suffering, but because part of them can't imagine how to continue being someone different after such a great loss. Meanwhile, the world continues to demand normality. People ask when you'll get better, when you'll react, when you'll go back to normal. But nobody asks how many parts of you were trapped in that last goodbye, And perhaps that's precisely where many people break down in silence, because they try to appear strong while emotionally they've been exhausted for a long time. Margarita started forgetting dates. She would let water boil until it evaporated. I would fall asleep on the sofa without realizing it. Sometimes I would spend hours staring at the television, which was turned off, not because I was thinking about something specific, but because the tired mind enters a strange state of emotional disconnection, a place where feeling less seems like the only possible way to continue enduring the pain. And that's frightening because it seems invisible to those on the outside. The person still gets up. They still say, "Good morning." They still exist. But internally, they've lost connection with almost everything that made life seem alive before. Some people stop cleaning because they can no longer feel the future. The daughter started crying when she realized that for years she had misinterpreted everything. She thought her mother was giving up on life, but now she understood that her mother was just trying to survive in the only emotional way she could find. And then, while picking up some clothes scattered on the floor, she found a small notebook hidden inside the nightstand. The pages were filled with short notes, some almost illegible. "Today I tried to open the window. Today I managed to take the plates off the table. Today I thought about cleaning the room, but I missed it too much." Each sentence seemed like a silent portrait of an emotional war that no one had seen happening. Margarita wasn't standing still because she didn't care. She was too tired trying to carry a grief she never managed to fully express. And perhaps many people watching this now know exactly that feeling. The feeling of appearing functional on the outside, while everything crumbles inside in absolute silence. The feeling of being exhausted without knowing how to explain it. Of avoiding people because you can no longer pretend everything is okay. Of feeling guilty for not being able to do simple tasks as before. Because when the mind is emotionally overloaded, even existing begins to seem too heavy. Except that almost no one talks about it without judgment. Almost no one understands that psychological suffering doesn't always destroy a person visibly. Sometimes he just erases small parts of it every day, slowly, silently, until all that's left is someone surviving on autopilot within their own routine. And perhaps the saddest part of all is realizing how many people live like this without anyone noticing. Lonely people, overwhelmed, grieving, silent. People who don't need to hear, react. They just need to feel that someone finally understood what they've been trying to endure alone for so long. If this story made you think of someone, comment "I understand" below. And like this video so that more people stop confusing emotional pain with laziness or failure. Now click on the video that's appearing on the screen, because maybe it will explain a part of your pain that no one has ever been able to put into words.